The Rayburn House office building was unusually packed. The room buzzed with a low hum of tension, reporters setting up their cameras, aides whispering final notes into their representatives' ears. On one side of the long table sat Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, known for her passionate defenses and sharp tongue. On the other sat Vice President JD Vance, calm, collected, and as prepared as a chess master about to move his queen. The hearing was about federal housing reform. But everyone knew this wasn't just a policy discussion, it was political theater, and the spotlight was squarely on them. Crockett leaned into her microphone, eyes steady, voice rising. "You sit here, Mr. Vice President, talking about efficiency and waste while people in my district are living in buildings with mold, broken elevators, and no heat in the winter," she said, her voice edged with frustration. "You talk about Ohio, but in Dallas, people like Maria, a single mother of two, are still waiting for housing support that your policies have gutted." The room stilled. Crockett's passion was unmistakable. She continued, flipping through her notes, detailing how families in Dallas were being pushed further into poverty, how federal cuts had hit urban neighborhoods harder than ever. "You can show me numbers," she said, jabbing her finger at the papers before her, "but numbers don't show you Maria's tears when her kids are coughing through the night because of black mold. You don't know that pain." Some murmurs of support came from her side of the room. A few nods. Crockett glanced at Vance, expecting rebuttal, perhaps even guilt. But instead, he was stone-faced, calculating. When it was his turn to speak, Vance didn't rush. He took a slow breath, leaned forward, and began in a measured, sincere tone. "Congresswoman," he began, "I don't think poverty cares whether you're in Dallas or Youngstown. It doesn't care whether you're white or black. But what it does care about, what it feels, is failure." He paused just long enough to let the words land. "And when you stand here blaming me and this administration, you're dodging the bigger question. Why, after decades of your party's leadership in Dallas, are people like Maria still without safe housing?" The room shifted. Crockett's eyes darted down to her papers. She flipped a page. Then another. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. "You have an answer," Vance pressed gently, "or just more stories?" Crockett searched again, but the numbers weren't there. The response she needed was missing. And in that silence, thick, heavy, undeniable, the audience felt the momentum shift. "I'm not here to hurt you, Congresswoman," Vance continued, now lowering his voice, making it more intimate. "I'm here for Carl. For Maria. For people who don't have time to wait for another failed bill. We need solutions. Not emotions." He spread his hands slightly, almost welcoming them all into the fold. "And solutions start by admitting the policies you support haven't worked. Not for Dallas. Not for Ohio. Not for anyone." The silence was louder than any argument. Vance looked around the room, eyes steady, jaw firm. "We can do better. We must do better. But to do that, we need truth, not tears. We need accountability, not accusations. And we need action, not stories that break hearts but build no homes." The audience was still. Then it started, slow applause at first, then growing louder. Not just Republicans, but independents. Even some journalists. Vance ended with a final line that landed like a blade. "Congresswoman, you may move hearts. But moved hearts don't pay rent. If you truly want to help people, bring solutions, not tears." Applause erupted. Crockett sat, still flipping through her notes, now limp in her hands. Her face drained of energy. A nearby Democratic senator whispered to an aide, "She didn't stand a chance." Across the table, JD Vance adjusted his tie with calm precision. He didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He knew exactly what he'd done. And the cameras had caught it all. The impact of JD Vance's final words still reverberated in the room, like a thunderclap that refuses to fade. "Moved hearts don't pay rent," hung in the air as the audience absorbed the force of the statement, their eyes flicking between Crockett and Vance. The audience had grown tense, like spectators at the climax of a heated match, but now, a heavy silence had descended over the hearing room. Jasmine Crockett, who had been on the attack moments earlier, sat frozen at the table. Her hands gripped a pen, twirling it between her fingers, but her eyes were distant. The sharp, forceful energy she had entered the room with seemed to have evaporated. Instead of looking forward, as if she were ready to mount a counterattack, her gaze was turned downward, her expression caught somewhere between shock and disbelief. The weight of her defeat had settled over her like an invisible cloak. Behind her, the Democratic senators seemed to react in real time, shuffling through their notes, searching for something, anything, that could give them a way to regain control of the narrative. They exchanged quick, frustrated whispers, but the reality was clear. This had not gone as planned. One Democratic senator leaned in toward an aide, muttering quietly, "She didn't stand a chance." The words stung, even though they were barely audible. But the truth was undeniable. Crockett had been caught off guard. She had come to the hearing ready to fight with passion, but she had underestimated Vance's preparedness and strategy. Her argument, relying heavily on emotional appeals and personal stories, had been no match for Vance's cold, calculated delivery. In contrast, Vance sat back in his chair, his posture relaxed, his face composed. He adjusted his tie with the calm assurance of a man who had just made his point perfectly. He wasn't reveling in his victory, but it was clear he knew what had just transpired. He had not just defended his position, he had dismantled his opponent with surgical precision. A few Republican senators, standing behind Vance, exchanged nods of approval, some of them even smiling discreetly. One whispered to another, "He just put an end to her." Vance's aide, standing to the side, checked his phone and flashed a quick smile as he read the first few notifications of the viral response to Vance's statement. The online buzz had already begun. In the back of the room, a journalist quickly pulled out their phone, capturing the last 30 seconds of the exchange. Within moments, they uploaded the clip to Twitter with a succinct, explosive caption. JD Vance just destroyed Jasmine Crockett. This is history. The tweet was like a match to dry tinder, igniting almost immediately. It wasn't just a single clip, it was a moment. A clear, powerful statement that, in one fell swoop, encapsulated the ideological divide between the two parties, the urban versus rural, the emotional versus the rational. And it wasn't long before it spread like wildfire across social media platforms. By the time the hearing room began to empty, the hashtag #VanceClapback was trending on Twitter. Clips of the final exchange were edited with dramatic effects on TikTok, where young users across the country weighed in. The clip was everywhere. Even a conservative news outlet quickly posted an analysis, stating, JD Vance delivered a masterstroke, showcasing not just passion but the power of practical thinking. Social media erupted in support of Vance. His line, "Moved hearts don't pay rent," was now plastered across memes, photos, and posts. One conservative influencer posted, "Vance taught the Democrats a lesson. When you're fighting for real people, you don't just cry about it, you bring solutions." Vance's message had gone beyond just policy, it was a symbol. A clear-cut statement against empty promises and ineffective policies that had failed so many Americans, especially those in places like Youngstown and other struggling rural areas. But on the other side, Crockett's team was scrambling. In the quieter corners of the room, her aides were furiously typing on their phones, sending urgent updates to the communications team, trying to manage the growing tide of criticism. Some members of her staff exchanged nervous glances, knowing that things had gone terribly wrong. Meanwhile, Crockett, still seated at the table, appeared overwhelmed. One of her aides leaned in to offer a few quick words of reassurance, but she barely reacted, nodding weakly, her eyes glued to the table. She knew, deep down, that this wasn't just a loss in the hearing room. It was a loss that would follow her out into the public eye. She could feel the eyes of the media on her, even though the cameras were now focused on Vance's quiet triumph. A Democratic senator near Crockett leaned in and whispered, "This isn't over. We need a response. We'll figure something out." But the defeat in the air was undeniable. As the room emptied, the murmurs of journalists and political staffers were loud and rapid, as if trying to make sense of what had just happened. The contrast between Crockett's deflated posture and Vance's poised confidence was striking. Outside the hearing, the reactions were swift. News outlets scrambled to cover the aftermath. Fox News went live with an analysis that praised Vance's command of the situation, noting how his emphasis on practical solutions had left Crockett with no counter. The headline read, "Vance's rational approach exposes Crockett's emotional appeal." Even more neutral outlets like CNN acknowledged that Crockett had been outmatched, though some still offered sympathy for her intent. Across Dallas, the fallout was immediate. Crockett had been popular for her fiery speeches and impassioned pleas for change, but now her supporters were starting to question her ability to follow through. At a community event, one local resident, a single mother living in substandard housing, commented, "I wanted her to win. But she wasn't prepared. I feel like we needed someone who could fight back with facts. Vance had the numbers. She had the heart. But that wasn't enough." In Youngstown, Ohio, things were different. JD Vance's victory resonated deeply, especially among working-class residents who felt ignored by the political elite. A factory worker, leaning against a rusted steel beam, commented, "Vance is from here. He gets us. He talked about Carl, and that's my story. That's my family." As the day wore on, the viral clip continued to spread. It was reshared on every platform, from Twitter to TikTok to Facebook. The phrase, "moved hearts don't pay rent," was now shorthand for the ideological battle Vance had just won: practical solutions versus emotional appeals. It was more than just a slogan, it was a rallying cry. Crockett, meanwhile, continued to try and spin the narrative. In a press conference later in the day, she attempted to frame the loss as a moment of emotional vulnerability, saying, "We're fighting for people like Maria. They're the ones who need our help, and I'll keep fighting for them no matter what." But her words didn't carry the same weight they once had. The damage had been done. The story of the hearing, now spreading across news outlets and social media, was no longer about just a debate on housing. It had become a symbol of the larger cultural and political divide, of raw emotion clashing with cold, hard facts. And for JD Vance, it was a defining victory. It was a moment that solidified his position as a rising star in the Republican Party. By the time the hearing room had emptied and the cameras had packed away their lenses, the battle had been won. And it was clear that for Jasmine Crockett, the road to recovery would not be as simple as a few passionate speeches. The world was already moving on, and the viral clip of her defeat would follow her long after the hearing had ended. The echo of JD Vance's words still rang through the political landscape as the following days unfolded. His "moved hearts don't pay rent" resonated far beyond the walls of the hearing room, reverberating across the media, social platforms, and, most importantly, the minds of Americans from coast to coast. It had become a battle cry for those who felt forgotten by the political establishment, for those who believed that emotion alone could no longer guide the future of the country. Jasmine Crockett, on the other hand, was left to grapple with the fallout. The weight of defeat wasn't something she could easily shake. In her office late that night, a few hours after the press conference, she sat in silence, her fingers hovering over the keyboard, but no words came. The political machine that had once embraced her now seemed alien, like a vast, indifferent force she could no longer control. Her aides had prepared the usual statements, trying to spin the loss into something more palatable for her supporters, but she knew it wasn't working. The online backlash was relentless. Her Twitter feed, once filled with praise and encouragement, now harbored vitriol and mockery. People were comparing her to a deer caught in headlights, frozen and defenseless under the spotlight. The memes were harsh. Her face twisted in disbelief as Vance landed his final blow was captured and endlessly shared. The phrase, "moved hearts don't pay rent," had become shorthand for everything that had gone wrong. Even her closest allies were beginning to express concern. The next day, as Crockett prepared for a round of interviews, a Democratic strategist leaned in and whispered, "You need to find a way to respond. Vance's line is everywhere. If you don't regain control of the narrative, this could define your entire career." It was a harsh reality. Crockett had hoped for a win, not just for herself, but for the communities she represented. She had come to Congress to bring change, to lift up those who had been left behind. But now, after Vance's decisive strike, the focus was no longer on the issues. It was about optics, messaging, and who had the strongest platform to carry forward their vision of America. Meanwhile, JD Vance seemed to thrive in the aftermath. He wasn't gloating, but there was a subtle satisfaction in the air. Vance's campaign staff was quick to capitalize on the momentum. Every interview, every public appearance, was carefully crafted to reinforce the themes he had raised in that pivotal moment. He didn't just speak about policy, he spoke about identity. He had positioned himself as a voice for the forgotten, the people left behind in the ever-changing tide of American politics. In an appearance on Fox News, Vance was asked about his exchange with Crockett. With a smirk barely visible, he replied, "Look, it's simple. We can't keep throwing money at problems and expecting things to change. We need real solutions. The emotional appeals only go so far. I believe in moving the needle with results, not rhetoric." The Republican base ate it up. For them, it wasn't just about housing or healthcare, it was about a broader cultural battle. Vance was able to frame the conversation as one of common sense versus the elite, reinforcing the narrative that the so-called progressives in the Democratic Party were more interested in making speeches than actually getting things done. The line, "Moved hearts don't pay rent," was now more than a quote. It was a banner, a clarion call for the Republican agenda. It went viral, being shared by every conservative influencer, from talking heads on cable news to pundits on conservative blogs. They rallied around Vance, viewing him as someone who had not only won the battle but had also reshaped the debate on his terms. Back in Washington, the media was also abuzz. The entire hearing had been reframed in the public discourse as a battle between emotional appeals and pragmatic solutions. It wasn't just a matter of policy anymore. It had become an ideological struggle, with Vance portraying himself as the voice of reason against a sea of empty promises. His victory was seen as the latest win for populist rhetoric, with many pundits drawing parallels between Vance and other successful populist figures on the global stage. But Crockett was determined not to go down without a fight. Though the public perception was shifting, she knew she couldn't simply allow Vance's narrative to take root unchecked. She had to act quickly. That night, in a quiet moment of clarity, she realized that what she had been missing all along wasn't a response to Vance's rhetoric, it was a reconnection to the heart of her campaign. The following morning, Crockett held a press conference, an attempt to regain her footing. But this time, she didn't come out swinging with facts and figures. Instead, she focused on the personal stories of the people she represented, stories of hardship, resilience, and hope. She spoke of Maria, the single mother whose fight to keep a roof over her children's heads had sparked her initial desire to run for office. Crockett talked about Carl, the elderly man living in a dilapidated apartment building, who had written her a letter begging for help. She emphasized how these real, human experiences were the reason she got into politics. However, despite her heartfelt message, the moment fell flat. The media's attention had already been claimed by Vance. His victory was the story. The viral videos of Crockett's stunned expression during the hearing were still fresh in the public's mind, overshadowing anything she said in the press conference. The perception had already been set, Vance was the one with the answers, and Crockett was the one who had failed to deliver. Back in the heartland, the contrast between Crockett's defeat and Vance's rising star couldn't have been more pronounced. In Ohio, the shift in public opinion was palpable. In the rural towns, people had felt disconnected from Washington for years, and Vance's message had resonated deeply. To them, it wasn't just about Vance winning a debate, it was about their voices finally being heard. He spoke their language, understanding the struggles of everyday people in a way that Crockett, despite her passion, simply hadn't. As the week wore on, Crockett's internal struggle intensified. She knew that this loss, this moment of vulnerability, would follow her for a long time. The future of her career, and perhaps her political identity, was now in jeopardy. She had to find a way to turn the tide, but as she looked at the media reports and the countless social media posts, one thing was clear: the battle she had waged against Vance wasn't just a debate, it was a turning point. But JD Vance wasn't just riding the wave of victory. He knew that this moment, this victory, was a critical inflection point in his own political journey. The attention he had garnered wasn't just fleeting, it was the foundation of a larger movement, one that could shape the future of American politics. His line, "Moved hearts don't pay rent," had struck a chord, and it was now ingrained in the political lexicon. As the dust settled on this pivotal moment in American politics, one thing was clear: the battle between emotion and pragmatism, between vision and reality, had only just begun.